Eye on the Storm, Hurricane Season 2019.
Well, hello there. Good evening and welcome to Eye on the Storm, your weekly in-depth look at the tropics and how it will impact you. I'm CBS 17 Chief Meteorologist Wes Sowenstein here in Raleigh, North Carolina. And after more than 20 weeks of coming to you right here every Wednesday night, this is our last scheduled episode. November starts Friday, and as you know, things calm down in November. And man, are we going out in style. We've got a great show tonight. As part of this country experiences winter-like conditions and we get ready to trick or treat tomorrow, we've got a treat. We are going to go talk to the National Hurricane Center in Miami, Florida. We have Hurricane Specialist Unit Branch Chief Dr. Michael Brennan. He's going to take us behind the scenes of what happens at the Hurricane Center in Miami and help us look back at what we've all lived through during the 2019 hurricane season so far. I say so far because, as you know, the season doesn't officially end until November 30th. But before we get to our first guest, let's take a look at what's going on right now in the Atlantic on this 30th day of October. We've got subtropical storm Rebecca. Let me give you a few stats about storms this late in the season. Rebecca is our 17th named storms, and there have only been 6 other seasons that have had 17 or more named storms by this day, October 30th. 6 of them. So we're in rare territory here, but the most recent ones have all happened kind of close together. 2010, 2011, and 2012 all had 17 storms or more by the 30th day of October. It's interesting, think back of the year we've had, 7 of the first 16 named storms lasted less than 24 hours. 7 of the first 16 didn't even last a day. So that's an amazing statistic. And as we kind of take a step back and look at what's going on all across the Atlantic, you know, the more interesting weather, to be honest with you, is back here in mainland United States. We've got a strong cold front. People have had snow. Some people haven't got out of single digits. Others are going to be in the 80s on Thursday as we get ready to trick or treat. A massive cold front and severe weather moving across the country. That's the big weather story. Rebecca, not so much. I mean, I'll step back and let you take a look. Could you find Rebecca if I really held your feet to the fire? I mean, I had to look closely. It's actually this little swirl up here of clouds. Good news, as you can see, we look at the loop from the last 24 hours. It's moving away from mainland. It'll eventually get close to the Azores, but that's about it. You know, we look along the intertropical convergence zone coming off the coast of Africa. Good week to be in the Caribbean or the Gulf of Mexico or around the Bahamas. There's just not a lot going on, and that tends to happen this time of year. That's why the season ends in another month. There's usually just not a whole lot going on, but we still have a track. We still have now 17 named storms, and subtropical storm Rebecca, which did form earlier today, has 45-mile-per-hour winds, and it's moving to the east at 13 miles per hour. It'll hold on to subtropical storm status, probably not officially becoming a tropical storm. We don't delineate whether or not we count it in the name list, if it's subtropical or tropical. It's checked off the list, the R storm this year. So it'll hold on for the next couple of days, but then it'll just kind of fizzle out. As far as this far north in the Atlantic, I've got another great statistic for you. Again, I follow on Twitter Dr. Phil Klausbach. He's one of the smartest hurricane guys in the whole world from Colorado State University. This is the farthest north an Atlantic named storm has formed this late in the year since 1975. So in more than 40 years, we haven't had a storm form this late in the season this far north. So again, Rebecca is flirting with some history right now. So let's kind of take a look back and where we are in the season. This is a graph we've shown many times throughout the year, and this shows tropical activity in graph form. Across the top, as we go from left to right, that takes us through the year, the calendar year, and then number of storms per 100 years. So this is kind of the climatological look at tropical activity. The peak of the season, September 10th, that's a date that we kind of commit to memory over the years. That's when we know is on average the peak of the hurricane season. So where are we right now? We are way on the backside. We are starting to really come down the mountain of hurricane and tropical storm activity as we get ready to wrap up October. But it's also interesting to look back where we are now. How does that compare to where we are at the beginning of the season? The activity we normally see around the 30th day of October is very similar to the activity that we see around the 1st of August. And you think about it, August is one of the busier hurricane months, and the activity that we see October 30th is very similar to what we see on the first day of August. Also, as we get ready for November, we don't see tropical storms that often or hurricanes form in November, but 8% of the hurricanes throughout the entire year form in November. So August, September, the two busiest months. October, which we're wrapping up, is the third busiest. And surprisingly, the fourth busiest is November. November has as much activity as June and July combined. If you think about it, when the hurricane season starts, we usually have something right off the bat, and then it's kind of dead throughout most of July. So there's not a lot in the beginning of the season, but it's the same amount as what we see form throughout the entire month of November. So Rebecca is checked off the list, the 17th named storm this season. What's interesting about this season, we've had two Cat 5s, Dorian and Lorenzo. We've had other major hurricanes, Umberto. Rebecca, a subtropical storm, is the 17th named storm. It's also interesting, about 7 years ago, Hurricane Sandy was hitting the East Coast. That was the S named storm. So in 2012, it was also a busy year. We're on the R named storm. So 17 storms down. I want to take a look back at what the forecast said at the beginning of the year to see how the forecast worked out. So first of all, the average number of named storms we get is 12. The forecast from North Carolina State, from Colorado State, and from our government, NOAA, and the Climatic Data Center, all had below 17. So while this storm is way far out in the Atlantic and won't impact anyone in the United States, it does go down as a named storm, 17 of them. So we have now exceeded, of course, the average for this time of year and all the forecast that we expected. As we look back at last year, how does this compare to last year? Last year we had 15 named storms. Again, that was an above average year. This year 17, last year 15. The forecast last year, very similar to this year, 10 to 16. So they were right in line last year, but it looks like we fell a little bit short of the forecast totals for this year's. And I mentioned what was going on 7 years ago. You know, the one thing I remember about Superstorm Sandy, and I'll show you the track here in a second, Sandy canceled Halloween for a lot of kids in the Northeast because it was so bad, power was out, they had flooding, it was a disaster. But here's how Sandy started. It started on October 22nd, flirted along the east coast of the United States, and then made that very unusual turn to the left. Most storms, when they get up in this territory, just because of many things, including how our Earth rotates and revolves, most storms turn out to the northeast. This one was a very rare one, and 7 years ago was turning inland, turning to the left, turning northwest, and created a lot of problems right around Halloween in 2012. So that's a look back at Superstorm Sandy. I want to take another look back. I want to take you back to the 2010 hurricane season. That year was a record setter. We had 19 named storms. There they all are. But the interesting thing about 2010, of the 19 named storms, no hurricanes made landfall in the United States. Seems like we learn a lesson every year during the hurricane season. That was an interesting lesson to learn because it was so busy, but we got lucky. No hurricanes hit the United States. It was a different story. It was a different lesson learned in 1992. We only had 7 named storms. Here they are back in 1992, but in those 7 was Hurricane Andrew. Hurricane Andrew is one of only 4 Category 5 hurricanes to hit the United States. It hit South Florida, right around the Miami area, then moved through the Gulf and hit Louisiana. But we only had 7. One of them was a monster, and it was a historic storm, devastated South Florida and parts of Louisiana. 19 and 7. 19 you think would be a really bad season, but no hurricanes hit the United States. I want to take you back to another season, and this will be what I finish up with before we go down to Miami. This is a look back at the 1887 hurricane season. And as we get ready for November, I just want to kind of give you some perspective as to what type of activity we see in November. In 1887, it is the only season on record with more than one hurricane after the second week of November, after November 13th. So 1887, the only season on record with more than one hurricane. And actually in that year, that late in the season, late November into December, we had 3 systems, 2 hurricanes and 1 tropical system, 1 tropical storm. So it's very, very rare to see late season hurricanes form. And as I just showed you, it's also very rare to see any tropical activity, as only 8% of hurricanes since the 1850s up until now form in November in the tropical Atlantic. No doubt one of the busiest spots in our country over the last few months has been the Hurricane Center in Miami, Florida. And joining us now is Dr. Michael Brennan. He is the branch chief for the Hurricane Specialist Unit at the Hurricane Center in Miami, Florida. Doc, thanks so much for spending some time with us this night. I guess the first thing we got to ask, and I know a lot of our viewers are wondering, what is a branch chief in the Hurricane Specialist Unit? Break that down for us, please.
Sure. Well, here at the National Hurricane Center, we have 3 different units in that make up the center. So the Hurricane Specialist Unit has 10 forecasters, and we're the ones that issue the forecast, the watches and warnings for tropical cyclones in the North Atlantic and Eastern North Pacific. So as the branch chief, I supervise those 10 forecasters, and so I'm in charge of the overall day-to-day hurricane forecast operations here at the Hurricane Center, in addition to doing a lot of briefings and supervising the forecast process. I do a lot of things with policy and the Weather Service, developing new products, outreach and training to our domestic and international partners. So it's a pretty wide-varying job. I still do a little forecasting from time to time as well.
Right, right. So is your job any more hectic, say when Dorian's over the Bahamas and headed for the U.S. versus now when things are starting to calm down? I can imagine so.
Sure. Yeah. Our business is activity dependent. So when we have, storms that are affecting land areas, especially, or we have a lot of tropical cyclones throughout our area of responsibility, it can get really busy. We need to staff up, bring more people on shift. Obviously, there's more watch and warning coordination and messaging and products that get done when we have storms that are affecting land. In particular, for the United States, we're doing extra briefings for FEMA and states and coordinating with all the local National Weather Service offices and interacting with the media to get the message out. So the level of busyness goes up and down during the season, depending on how many storms we have and where those storms happen to be.
Well, the storm of record this year is no doubt Dorian. I mean, have you ever seen anything like that, either in a textbook or in person? I mean, this was a very unusual storm.
Yeah, Dorian had a lot of twists and turns to it, all the way from its early formation as a very weak system out to the east of the Lesser Antilles. It was something that the model guidance wasn't even set on whether it was going to survive into the Caribbean Sea. There were models that were showing it dissipating early on, and then it sort of had that jump in the track when the center moved over St. Lucia and the center reformed and ended up passing to the east of Puerto Rico over the Virgin Islands instead of closer to Puerto Rico or near Hispaniola. And that obviously had a lot of downstream impacts on how strong the storm became in the Bahamas. And then obviously we had the catastrophe that unfolded in portions of the Northwest Bahamas and the Abacos and Grand Bahama Islands that were essentially lashed by a Category 5 hurricane for hours and hours upon end with storm surge and wind, and just a devastating situation there as Dorian rapidly strengthened right before it reached Great Abaco Island, and then maintained that Category 5 intensity for some time. And then also had the challenges of Dorian stalling out, not only bringing a prolonged period of just devastating impacts to those islands, but then also making the forecast quite difficult for what the impacts of Dorian were going to be here in the United States. From Florida all the way up to North Carolina, there was uncertainty as to how close Dorian would pass to the east coast of the Florida Peninsula. It ended up staying just far enough offshore that there were impacts, but the core of the hurricane stayed offshore through Florida. But then it actually, as you know, your viewers, especially in North Carolina, would know it did make landfall in Cape Hatteras and brought storm surge and wind impacts all the way up into portions of South Carolina and especially North Carolina. So a very impactful storm that played out over the course of a couple of weeks, it felt like, because it was a very slow-moving system.
Dr. Brennan, I got to ask you, this seems to be a bad trend for the East Coast. Big, slow-moving storms. I mean, Dorian and Matthew and Florence. What do you make of all these slow-moving storms on the East Coast? Is it bad luck?
Yeah, it's hard to tell. Again, the records for hurricanes, even the tracks we have in the Atlantic Basin are really not all that complete more than maybe 70, 80 years ago in terms of the details of the storms. And certainly we've seen some very slow moving big storms over the last few years. And those create challenges because not only do you get the conditions, the hazardous conditions last a lot longer if the storm's not moving in one particular location, but slow-moving big storms are particularly bad for two things: storm surge and rainfall. And the water hazards are what end up killing most people in tropical cyclones in the United States. So for example, in Florence, you had the worst storm surge all the way up the Neuse River in the New Bern area, and then just a catastrophic rainfall event. We've also seen catastrophic rainfall flooding from Harvey in the Gulf Coast, and then also from Imelda earlier this year brought devastating flooding again to parts of Texas. So slow-moving tropical cyclones near land can really be a real dangerous situation, especially from those water hazards.
We also find ourselves in the teens again with number of named storms. Is that a trend that you see continuing based on big picture and the way our globe is going?
Well, in the Atlantic Basin, we've always seen this sort of multi-decadal trend where we have, 20 some years of relatively quiet periods and then 20 or so years of more active periods. We looked like maybe earlier in this decade that we were sort of perhaps coming out of an active period in the sort of the mid-2010s. We had a couple of relatively quiet seasons, not very many named storms, but certainly starting in late in 2016 and the last three seasons, we've had a large number of named storms, a large number of major hurricanes, especially in the western part of the basin. We went since 2005 all the way to 2017 without a major hurricane landfall in the United States. And then since then, we've had Harvey, we've had Irma, we've had Maria hit Puerto Rico, and we've had Michael last year make landfall in the Florida Panhandle. And so we've had a lot of very impactful storms after a relatively quiet period for portions of the U.S. coast. The other thing is that some of the storms this year, we had a lot of sort of short-lived weak tropical storms, so that sort of pushed the numbers up overall, but we had some sort of marginal storms that didn't last very long. So, we try not to pay too much attention to the overall number of storms and get people to focus on the risk that's there where they live every year, because if a storm affects you, that makes it a busy season.
Right. Let's talk about a couple of the other storms this year, Olga and Nestor.
Yeah.
Maybe borderline storms. Can you kind of take us behind the scenes about what's happening there at the Hurricane Center in Miami, about how you guys decide we are going to name this, we aren't going to name this, especially when they're so close to being a storm or not being a storm?
Yeah, we have, cyclones exist on this sort of continuum where you have, tropical cyclones and you have sort of wintertime storms, and then you have this whole sort of gamut that runs in between where there's a little bit of a gray area. But, we have our definition of a tropical cyclone is it's a warm core, non-frontal cyclone that develops over tropical or subtropical waters, and it has to have organized deep convection or thunderstorm activity. And then it also has to have what we call a well-defined center, a center that's very easy to pinpoint in the wind field. So we look for all those characteristics before we go ahead and classify something as a tropical cyclone. Some are more clear-cut than others. We try to make the best use of all the data we have. Both in Nestor and in Olga, we had the benefit of being able to have aircraft reconnaissance fly into the storms, and they both did tip over the threshold to become tropical cyclones. Even though they sort of had an atypical structure most of their life cycle. We even saw Barry earlier in 2019 have a very atypical structure in the northern Gulf of Mexico and went on to become a hurricane. So we try to call the storms what they are from our best analysis, and then we also try to handle the service aspect as best we can, whether that means we handle it with issuing, say, tropical storm watches and warnings for portions of the Gulf Coast like we did for Nestor, which had large-scale impacts. And we were able to predict that pretty well and see that it was going to transition right as it made landfall or shortly thereafter. And then the impacts along the East Coast were handled as a post-tropical or extratropical cyclone without tropical cyclone watches and warnings. Olga, on the other hand, we expected to only be a tropical cyclone for a brief period of time, and it does look like it transitioned before it made landfall in the central Gulf Coast in Louisiana. So we decided that the hazards would be best handled in a situation like that by using the non-tropical products that are issued by local National Weather Service offices. But Olga obviously had some significant impacts in Louisiana with gusty winds, a lot of power outages. So we try to make the best decision we can on how to handle these storms and try to make it collectively as an enterprise within the Weather Service and communicate that to our media partners and try to get the word out about the hazards, because that's what affects people. People don't really care whether the winds and the rain and the coastal flooding or storm surge come from a tropical storm or something that's a more hybrid type system. We just try to cover the hazards as best we can.
Right, right. One of the things I found that whether it's students I talk to or viewers, they're fascinated with the Hurricane Hunter aircraft in that program. How involved are you guys in communicating with them about where to go, about what they're seeing when they're out there, flying through these powerful hurricanes?
Yeah, we actually have a lot of communication with them directly and indirectly. We actually have a unit here at the Hurricane Center called CARCA, which stands for the Chief of Aerial Reconnaissance Coordination for all hurricanes. And they're actually an Air Force unit that works here at the Hurricane Center. And we coordinate with them every day during the hurricane season to schedule the Hurricane Hunter flights that we need to have fly into what we call invest missions, which are systems that are developing that might not be a tropical depression or tropical storm yet, all the way up to flights that are going to fly through and measure all the parameters in the center of a major hurricane. So they coordinate, they take the requirements from us as the forecasters, and then they coordinate with the Air Force and with NOAA to schedule the aircraft assets that are needed. And sometimes that can be challenging because we might have 3 or perhaps as many as 3 storms that we're trying to fly at the same time. Something maybe in the Gulf of Mexico, something near the Caribbean. They may be flying a storm out near Hawaii for the Central Pacific Hurricane Center. So it's sort of a puzzle with a lot of pieces that we have to put together to make sure that we can cover all of the storms that we need to with the aircraft assets we have. And then in addition, CARCA is, communicating with the crews on the aircraft, so we can come talk to them and say, hey, we want you to fly a slightly different pattern. We think the center is over here. Can you move over that way? And then they're sort of quality controlling all the data and providing it to us on the forecast floor so that we can try to make sense of it and then go back and forth with the folks on the plane if we have any questions. And then CARCA also is responsible for sending that data out to the world so that everybody can see it and take a look at it.
Very good. One of the best tools we have. Again, we're talking with Dr. Michael Brennan. He is the branch chief of the Hurricane Specialist Unit at the National Hurricane Center in Miami. 2 more things for you. I know meteorologists, sure, at least myself, speaking for myself and maybe our team here in Raleigh, we're always critical and very retrospective on our forecasts. How have you guys done on the forecast this year with all the storms that have come our way?
Well, every year and every storm presents its own sort of unique challenges. With something like Dorian, the track forecast was very complicated throughout the whole life cycle. And the intensity forecast, again, these storms that undergo rapid intensification can cause a lot of challenges. Our forecasts have started to improve for those situations, but they're not where we would like to be. So what we do is we go back for each individual storm and we look at the performance of the NHC forecast, and we look at the performance of all of the model guidance for both the track and the intensity forecast. We look at the timing of the watches and warnings we issued and how they verified. And then we go back after the season is over and we've done the post-analysis of every storm, and we'll go back and look at our seasonal statistics in terms of our track and intensity forecast errors for the whole year. And then we take those results and we work with the modeling community, try to provide feedback on what we think is working or not working with the various models in terms of track or intensity, and try to improve those and the guidance that we use for the next year. Now, overall, over time, our track forecast errors on average continue to go down, and that's a steady improvement that we've seen over the last 20 or 30 years, mainly driven by improvements in numerical modeling, but also in some ways that we found to combine models together into consensus aids and sort of use them as the basis of our track forecasting instead of picking one individual model. The intensity forecast errors, after many, many years of not really changing very much, have begun to decrease now in this decade. That's certainly for really the first time we've ever seen that. And we're not where we need to be, as I said before, especially for these rapid intensifying storms. but we are starting to see progress, and that's a big step in the right direction. So, something like Dorian, we had some very big intensity forecast errors, especially at longer lead times. Some of that was tied to the track forecast uncertainty. As initially, we were expecting Dorian to move over Hispaniola and weaken pretty substantially, and there was questions as to whether it would survive moving over that island and the topography there, and if it would have a chance to re-strengthen before it, say, approached the Bahamas or Florida. Obviously, Dorian moved well east of Hispaniola, never really weakened, and went on to become a Category 5 hurricane. So those are the types of situations where you can rack up some pretty large intensity forecast errors. But beyond just the track and intensity forecasting, we're really trying to focus more on the hazards. Can we get the word out to people to get them prepared for things like storm surge, which drives most of the evacuation decisions in the United States for hurricanes, rainfall, the winds? Can we effectively message the risk and how that risk is changing as the forecast evolves, as a storm approaches, and get that word out? And the end result in that is we try to minimize the effects of the storms on life and property. That's really what we're trying to do. We know that there's going to be damage when we have a big storm, but if we can minimize the loss of life and try to get people ready to survive the storm itself, and then also the after effects of the storm, these so-called indirect fatalities that we've seen increasing in the last few years, and that's all a part of our effort to try to reach out and get communities ready.
Yeah, as complicated as forecasting a hurricane on a planet spinning around the sun, you guys do a great job. I see you have your North Carolina State red on today, and I think that's the NC State bell tower behind you. You spent a lot of years in Raleigh. You had undergrad and master's and postgrad at NC State. Yep. So you were here during some really bad hurricanes for the Carolinas. Can you take us back to what that was like studying the meteorology and living through some of the worst of it?
Yeah, I've got a lot of connections to the North Carolina area. I was there. I first got to NC State in the summer of 1996, and I think just a couple of weeks before Hurricane Bertha made landfall near Cape Fear and moved up over eastern North Carolina. And then obviously later that fall in September, we had Hurricane Fran that brought a lot of high wind impacts to the Triangle region, power outages for days, the very vivid memories of that event. And that was a challenging forecast that also had a lot of impacts, not just at the coast, but well inland. And then, we had Floyd in 1999 that had the devastating flooding in eastern North Carolina, and then on to Isabel and other storms. So a lot of memories there of tropical storm and hurricane impacts in the Carolinas that are sort of shape your interest as you study in the field. But then also a lot of interest. My graduate work was actually more in winter storms. I looked a lot at the January 2000 snowstorm that brought over 20 inches of snow to the Triangle region. Did a lot of diagnostics of what was going on in that event and what the models missed that sort of led to a forecast failure there. So a lot of local connections, and that's a fun thing about living in an area where you have as dynamic weather as you do in North Carolina. You get to experience sort of the whole gamut.
Yes, both can cause equal amount of headaches, snow and the tropical season. So listen, you and your team, thank you for all the great work you guys do to keep us safe throughout the hurricane season and the off season. Dr. Michael Brennan, Branch Chief and Hurricane Specialist at the National Hurricane Center. Thank you, Doctor, for joining us.
Yeah, thanks, Wes.
And we'd like to thank you for spending part of your night and part of your hurricane season with us. This has been Eye on the Storm, your weekly in-depth look in the tropics across the eastern half of the United States. This is our last regularly scheduled program. If anything pops up throughout November during the hurricane season, as you know, the season goes officially until the end of November. We will be right back here, and of course, we'll be back next year. Thank you so much for spending time with us on Eye on the Storm. I'm Wes Hohenstein in Raleigh, North Carolina.